Swedish scientists first alerted the world to dangerous radiation. 2 days passed before the Russians acknowledged the nuclear disaster that happened at Chernobyl in the Ukraine. Western experts said that up to 100,000 people in the Ukraine would need medical treatment for the rest of their lives.
April 26, 1986, when the accident happened. It occurred in Chernobyl, Ukraine, after technicians caused the explosion. We'll be talking about Chernobyl's disaster in 1986 and how it's a turning point in history, as it affected the society near this area. Now, I believe that this disaster affected the whole Chernobyl community and is one of the worst disasters dealing with nuclear radiation, and it overall fits the theme of turning points in history because of these effects. It was around April 25, 1986, when these technicians would stay at Reactor 4 near Kiev. In their downtime, these technicians would perform cooling tests. But this doesn't go to plan. As you can see on the screen, explosions were pretty devastating. The World Nuclear Association states that the Chernobyl accident was caused by inadequately trained personnel and inexperiencedness. According to Britannica, they stated that the disaster was also caused by liquidation/cooling technicians and their lack of safety precautions during the disaster. This would ultimately lead into one person dying immediately after. One factor that we can consider is this dude named Bryukhanov. He was found guilty of crossing the safety violations, and he was the one that basically almost caused this whole entire disaster to happen. So he was put into jail, and that could have been a factor towards this disaster. Into National Geographic, despite attempts to shut down the reactor entirely, another power surge caused a chain of reactions of explosions inside. Now, finally, the nuclear core itself was exposed and radiation started moving through the wind and also into the atmosphere. This was the start of a series of events that lead into the containment and some of the destruction of Chernobyl. This next statement will be from National Archives. Now, the public, they didn't know about it right away. They would find out around late April to early May, as the Soviets wanted to disclose any further information. But eventually, it would slip out when they found out something. Scientists found out a spike in radiation in the air. Now, Soviets, they didn't really acknowledge this, but here's some more evidence that the public has found out the disaster after the scientists found research.
Kremlin acknowledged there'd been an accident, but only after Scandinavian scientists had picked up high radiation levels.
That video showed us that the scientists were the ones that found out about the situation. Soviets didn't even acknowledge this or tell the public about the situation. We can also see it from here.
Enormous amount of radioactivity must have gotten out of the power plant.
I believe this clip meant that they found out the radiation and not the Soviets telling them. This was when the public knew that something has happened. This was when they found out that it was traveling up north through Ukraine. According to USNRC, we can see that they called up emergency crews in order to try to contain the situation and make sure that no more fires could seek out. Their first attempt at containing the situation was not really good. They were not well equipped. They barely had any water. It was already like seeking hot. It was like 214 degrees. You can see that during the time they were going to announce a broadcast about this event. They were also going to continue to investigate the situation and de-escalate it. They were also willing to get any residents and people to help and make sure that this event does not slip under the radar. One of the things that the crew wanted to do was pour boron and sand over the reactor. You could see from this diagram that they just poured it inside, and this contained the heat. According to Adam Higginbottom, around 8 p.m. on April 26, 1986, they issued an order for mass evacuation of the citizens of Pripyat and Kiev. It was around 3 days later when they had 27,500 people had been evacuated, and they decided to supply with fresh water prepared to make a 30-kilometer fence, which is known as the exclusion zone. And this would help prevent people from getting too close to a nuclear reactor, as radiation was a huge problem.
It took a full 18 days before the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev made any public pronouncement on the nuclear disaster at Chernobyl.
So what were the results? As you see from that clip, the leader of the Soviets were gonna actually make an announcement after 18 days of not talking.
News. Добрый вечер, товарищи.
We were recently stricken by a disaster, the Chernobyl nuclear power accident. It deeply affected the Soviet people and disturbed world opinion.
The first result was that many thousands of people were diagnosed with radiation symptoms.
The Russians said up to 300 people were treated in hospital and that 31 had died in the accident. Nobody knew what the long-term effects would be. The reactor is
That clip showed us that many people were dealing with radiation problems after this event, and also this is a really good turning point because Chernobyl before, after one disaster, it caused like radiation to be seeping out everywhere and causing it to be almost uninhabitable. And as you can see from the photo diagram, there was around 1 million people who were affected by radiation during this time. Now, according to Alina Cardell, this also affected the wildlife. All the trees in 4 square miles around Chernobyl has died, and most of the trees had turned into a red-brown color. And this was called the Red Forest. Working on the Chernobyl power plant for 14 years, but eventually it would close down, so that was a development from them. According to National Geographic, after the Chernobyl disaster happened, the economic and political toll has ended of the USSR and fueled a global anti-nuclear movement where they closed down most of the reactors that they needed. They would then make the sarcophagus, which is to put it over the reactor, and you can see it today that it looks like it's been covered. Now all this information relates to one thing: the turning points in history. Now a turning point is an event that directly or sometimes indirectly causes change. The Chernobyl disaster of April 26, 1986 is a great example of
Here's Pripyat's main street 35 years ago. This is before the accident when the city was first founded roughly, and here is it now, fallen to ruins.
I believe that clip was a great example of how this is a turning point. As you can see from his photos that he was holding, that was Pripyat before the accident happened. After, it's almost uninhabitable and it looks almost abandoned. It's crazy how one event can cause such catastrophes. Another reason why it's an example of the theme is because over time they started to carry out more procedures about safety and communication. The exclusion zone is also still used today, as you need a tour guide or a permit to even enter the Chernobyl exclusion zone. This is also a turning point in history, as communication wasn't really the best during this disaster.
Authorities tried to hide the disaster, which had by that time claimed only 2 lives.
So they decided to make sure that they communicated with the public instead of just by themselves, so that everyone knows what to do during that situation. Now after this event, many people were traumatized because
в разные стороны с потолка начало сыпаться всякое строительный мусор, пыль. Из-под ног начала, как говорится, уходить земля, и погас свет.
This clip actually showed us how bad the event was and how it developed into like Chernobyl being one of the most radiated places in the world. The last piece of evidence I have to prove that this disaster fits perfectly into turning points in history is that ever since this disaster, one upside came from it, and it was the knowledge of reactors and safety. According to the World Nuclear Association, they would now make the security emergency procedures on the reactors faster and make sure that they've installed more inspection equipment to make sure that this event doesn't occur again. This shows us that this event was a learning experience, but also caused the places near Chernobyl, Ukraine, like Kiev and Pripyat, and one of the most radiated places in the world. So what can we take away from all of this? Well, first, we know that the Chernobyl disaster is one of the worst disasters of all time and caused the abandonment of Kiev and Pripyat, but eventually it will develop into more safety precautions to be made and to make sure that communication has always been met. This is an example of the theme because many people had to like evacuate the city and cause like a new lifestyle for them, and also they had to like add more safety precautions and made sure that this event never happens again.